Hello, everyone, and welcome. Today, we are going to explore a topic that I think is extremely important for anyone who is going to work in management, leadership, or conflict resolution. Our topic is stakeholder conflict and strategic negotiation. Now, when we hear the word conflict, many of us immediately imagine two people arguing, maybe a manager and an employee, maybe two colleagues who disagree. But in the real organizational world, conflict is rarely that simple. Sometimes it is not just two people. You may have management, employees, customers, regulators, investors, NGOs, local communities, and even the media, all with different expectations. And here is where conflict becomes interesting. Because everyone may be acting rationally, but they are acting according to different interests, different priorities, different sources of power, and different time horizons. So today I want you to move beyond the idea of simply asking, how do I resolve this argument? Instead, I want you to start asking, how do I design the negotiation system so that the conflict can actually be resolved? That is the mindset of a strategic negotiator. By the end of this session, I want you to be able to do 5 things. First, map the stakeholder ecosystem. You need to know who is involved, who has influence, and importantly, who may not be sitting at the negotiation table but can still influence the outcome. Second, we will differentiate between positional bargaining and interest-based negotiation. Third, we will use the 4PS framework: parties, positions, problems, and priorities. Fourth, we will look at power and culture. And finally, you will learn how to construct a negotiation matrix when you have 3, 4, or even 5 stakeholders involved. So this is not just about learning negotiation techniques. It is about learning how to think strategically about conflict. Let us begin with a very basic question. What exactly is a stakeholder? A stakeholder is an individual, group, or entity that can affect or be affected by the achievement of an organization's objectives. But I want you to notice something important here. A stakeholder is not necessarily someone who is directly involved in the organization. For example, employees and managers are obvious internal stakeholders. Shareholders are also stakeholders. But what about regulators, customers, suppliers, NGOs? Local communities, the media, financial institutions, they can all influence what an organization can or cannot do. And this is why stakeholder conflict is complicated. Stakeholders are also dynamic. Their interests can change. A stakeholder who supports you today may oppose you tomorrow if the circumstances change. So don't think of stakeholder mapping as something you do once and forget. It is something that needs to be continuously reassessed. Now, let's move to the next subtopic, that is ABCD model. Why do stakeholders actually come into conflict? Our slides introduce the ABCD model. A is asymmetrical information. B is bargaining power imbalance. C is competing logics. And D is divergent time horizons. Let's unpack these. A. Asymmetrical information. Imagine that one stakeholder knows something that another stakeholder doesn't know. Immediately, suspicion can develop. Why aren't they telling us? Are they hiding something? So, are they trying to take advantage of us? Information is therefore not simply a communication issue. It can become a source of power. B. Bargaining power imbalance. Imagine a regulator negotiating with a small community. The regulator may have legal authority. The community may not have that formal authority. But the community may have something else: moral legitimacy and public support. So power is not always about who has the biggest organizational position. See competing logics. This one is particularly important. Think about shareholders. Their primary concern may be profitability. Now think about an environmental NGO. Their concern may be ecological sustainability. Then think about a regulator. Their concern may be safety and compliance. All 3 stakeholders may be completely rational, but they are operating using different institutional logics, and that creates conflict. Divergent time horizons. This is one of my favorite points because it is often overlooked. Imagine a CEO who needs to show financial results this quarter. Now compare that with an environmental organization thinking about environmental consequences over the next 10 or 20 years. Both may be reasonable, but they are looking at different clocks. And when stakeholders operate according to different time horizons, reaching agreement becomes much more difficult. Now, we come to an important framework, the stakeholder salience model. Mitchell, Agel, and Wood identify three important attributes: power, legitimacy, and urgency. Let's think about these individually. Power asks, can the stakeholder influence what happens? Legitimacy asks, is their claim perceived to be appropriate or valid? Urgency asks, does this issue require immediate attention? Now, here's something interesting. A stakeholder who possesses all three becomes what we call a definitive stakeholder. And this matters because you cannot treat every stakeholder in exactly the same way. Strategic negotiation requires prioritization. You need to understand, who must I engage first? Who can influence the outcome? Who has a legitimate claim? And whose issue is becoming urgent? This is where stakeholder analysis becomes much more than simply making a list of stakeholders. Now, let's move into negotiation. There are two important paradigms we need to distinguish. The first is distributive bargaining. The second is integrative negotiation. Distributive bargaining is essentially, how much of the pie do I get? If there is RM 100 and I get RM 70, you get RM 30. That is a relatively fixed pie. This is what we normally call win-lose bargaining. But integrative negotiation asks a different question. Instead of asking how do we divide the pie, we ask, can we make the pie bigger? Maybe I care strongly about one issue while you care strongly about another issue. That creates an opportunity. And this leads us to one of the most important lessons from today's session. The greatest strategic error is assuming that a conflict is distributive when it is actually integrative. If you incorrectly assume that there is only one pie, you may never discover the possibility of creating a bigger one. Now, I want to introduce a very practical tool, the 4PS framework. The 4PS are parties, positions, problems, and priorities. Let's imagine you enter a negotiation. The first question is parties. Who is involved? But don't stop at the people sitting around the table. Ask who is absent but influential. These are sometimes called actors with shadow power. Next, positions. What do they say they want? For example, we want the project stopped. We want higher compensation. We want the factory expansion. These are positions, but positions are only the visible part of the conflict. And this takes us to the third P, problems. What is actually preventing agreement? Is it lack of information? Is it mistrust? Is the procedure unfair? Is there a power imbalance? Is there a psychological barrier? And finally, priorities. What does each stakeholder actually need? This is where we move from position to interest. And we also need to understand the stakeholder's BATNA. BATNA means the alternative available if no agreement is reached. In simple terms, what happens if I walk away? And that tells us something very important about the real negotiation power of each party. Now imagine something more complicated. You don't have two stakeholders. You have 4 or 5. Suddenly, negotiation is no longer just a conversation. It becomes a system. This is where the negotiation matrix becomes useful. For each stakeholder, we examine their interest, their position, their BATNA, their leverage, and our engagement strategy. For example, a regulator may prioritize compliance and safety. Their position may be to halt operations. Their BATNA could involve fines or regulatory action. Their leverage is legal power. Therefore, our strategy may be to collaborate and share information proactively. Now compare that with employees. They may prioritize job security and safety. Their position could be to halt work or strike. Their leverage may be operational. Therefore, consultation and involvement may be more appropriate. The important point is this: you don't negotiate with every stakeholder in exactly the same way. Strategic negotiation requires a customized approach. Let's now look at 3 advanced techniques. The first is log rolling. Log rolling means trading across issues that different parties value differently. Imagine employees care strongly about wages. Management cares strongly about scheduling flexibility. Instead of fighting over one issue, we can trade. Employees receive something highly valuable to them. Management receives something highly valuable to them. Neither party gets everything, but both parties get something that matters more. That's log rolling. The second technique is bridging. Bridging means creating a new option that satisfies the core interests of both sides. Instead of asking who has to give up, we ask, can we design something neither party originally proposed? And the third is coalition management. In multi-stakeholder conflict, weaker stakeholders may come together. Individually, they may have little influence. Together, they can become extremely powerful. So strategic negotiators must pay attention not only to individual stakeholders, but also to coalitions. Part 9, the power paradox. Now, let's discuss something fascinating, the power paradox. Sometimes the stakeholder with the least formal power may possess the greatest moral legitimacy. Think about the local community. They may not have financial power, they may not have legal authority, but they can influence public opinion. They can attract media attention. They can create reputational pressures. So if you have high formal power, don't assume you automatically control the outcome. And if you have low formal power, don't assume you are powerless. You may have process power. You can influence the agenda. You can control documentation. You can mobilize public opinion. You can influence reputation. Therefore, power in stakeholder conflict is multidimensional. Now, let's add another layer, culture. Negotiators not happen in a cultural vacuum. Some cultures are more high context. Relationships, trust, and indirect communication may be extremely important. Other cultures are more low context. People may prefer direct communication, explicit disagreement, and clear contracts. So imagine a negotiator who enters a relationship oriented culture and immediately says, okay, let's get straight to the contract. That may seem efficient to the negotiator, but the other party may think you haven't even taken the time to build trust. And the reverse can also happen. A negotiator who spends several meetings building relationships may frustrate someone who expects a fast, agenda-driven negotiation. So remember this. A strategic negotiator does not impose their own conflict style. They adapt. Adaptation is not weakness. It is strategic intelligence.